guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. This particular topic got a lot of energy when we were talking about it in College Curriculum Council. And so we thought it would be one that would generate a lot of interest in the faculty. It's one that we struggle with. Some of us here have actually made the transition from overhead slides, overhead projectors, to PowerPoint, and now are wondering about the next transition. But I think it's one that we all struggle with, and so we're very pleased to be here. I think it would be appropriate for us to begin with a word of prayer. I'm just looking for someone who doesn't have food in their mouth. Chad, are you good? I'm going to ask Chad Gibbs to open us with prayer. All right. One of the things we thought about is we wanted to get a range of presenters who have thought long and hard about the effective use of not just technology, but in particular around PowerPoint slides. So we're going to start with Dr. Lauren Marks, who's a professor of family life in the School of Family Life. Until a few years ago, Lauren and I thought we were the last people in the world not to have a cell phone, but I abandoned that club a few years ago. I think I'm not going to ask whether Lauren has done so or not. He maybe have made that technological transition as well. So he will talk to us, and then Dean Busby, who is the director of the School of Family Life, will present what I think is a somewhat less radical view, but still very interesting. And then Ramona Hopkins told me, that Brock Kerwin, our third presenter, is one who's really done a lot of thinking about this and has some really strong ideas about what works. Brock is, runs our MRI facility. And I suppose it probably could help to put pictures of brains up on the screen when you're teaching. So I can imagine some use for it there. Anyway, we've got a range of views here. And so the idea is they'd be presenting for 10 or 15 minutes. And then I think we should have some lively discussion afterwards. So thanks for doing this. We appreciate it. Lauren?
Lauren, can you send us a PowerPoint of your presentation?
Yeah. I already asked him that.
I'll send a handout around. It's scrawled by hand, of course. Quill pen. On these panels with 3 different prearranged speakers, we often have 2 respectable, highly qualified researchers, and then 1 wingnut for color and diversity. When I learned about today's presentation, I learned that Dean Busby, an exceptional scholar and teacher, would be here. I did not know Brock, but I went online and learned he has a staggering number of publications over the last 3 to 4 years. It was a relief to know that I'd be in company with such wonderful men, but then my slow but still functioning deductive powers kicked in, and I realized I am the crazy wingnut. Well, face it, embrace it, I say. So here we go. Part 1, the bag. One of the last times I used PowerPoint was during my faculty research presentation here at BYU 2 years ago. A final slide in that presentation featured the heading, "The top 5 reasons why you should not hire me." Yes, I'm serious. At this point, you're probably getting ready to lean over to somebody and say, "I thought he was just being self-deprecating, but that guy really is crazy." Continuing on. Following showing that slide, I became the pet diagnostic case for many of our clinical faculty in the School of Family Life. For a couple months, they got to argue amongst themselves about which mental health maladies I featured, and probably the only argument not presented was, no, he's completely sane. My purpose, however, was accomplished, because what I wanted was deep dialogue about whether they really wanted to hire me here or not. For reasons outside of the scope of today's discussion, I wanted to be a very careful hire or no hire at all. Anything but a rubber stamp. I wanted deep and intentional thinking to take place, and I was willing to go to some dangerously unorthodox measures to stimulate that thinking. If we are to move our students to think deeply, critically, and intentionally, it will likely require something more than PowerPoint slides. The technique that I just employed is what I call a BAG, B-A-G, a big autobiographical grabber. Now, after my bag, hopefully, you are mine. You are in the bag. You have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth next, but at least you're listening, and perhaps even thinking. However, it's not the technique that is the core motivation behind using this approach. The action-based message, hopefully, is this: your deep engagement, your critical thinking is sufficiently important to me that I will surrender my professorial dignity in order to transform a class into a life-changing experience. Part 2, some scripture on spiritual gifts. At least 3 places in the LDS canon we're taught in depth about spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians 12, the 10th chapter of Moroni, and the 46th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. In verse 16 of the latter, we hear about diversities of operations. Joseph Smith taught that no one who receives the gift of the Holy Ghost is left destitute of a spiritual gift. So, what is your gift? Alan, Shalom, Daya. What is your gift? To me, that is a fundamental question. Not whether to use PowerPoint or how to use PowerPoint, but what is your gift? The same section in verse 32 says, "Give thanks unto God for whatsoever blessing ye are blessed with." Again, what is your teaching-related blessing? For me, my gift is that I seem to fall in love deeply and quickly with people. My weakness, I have many, but one that relates to teaching, is that when I don't have notes to speedily read off of, I talk slower than John Wayne. And it has a narcoleptic effect on my audience, as many of you are already learning. Okay. Considering my gift and weakness together, I developed an approach that accounts for both. For me, this means a high level of interactivity. It means a lot of personal affection and a desire to hear the stories of those with whom I'm working, while keeping lectures mercifully brief and focused, and typically not using PowerPoint. However, I offer this as an illustration, not to be prescriptive. Your strengths and weaknesses differ from mine. Your class assignments, sizes, topics differ from mine. And so will your customized and inspired style. Part 3, some philosophy to mingle with the scripture that I just shared with you. I've compiled a list of a few of my all-time favorite one-liners from the Jewish philosopher and master teacher, Emmanuel Levinas. These insights reference what he called the face of the other. These may be based on a personal, esoteric, lifelong study of Levinas, or 30 minutes on Wikipedia. I plead the fifth on that. Quote 1, "The face speaks to me and thereby invites me into a relation. The face is a source from which all meaning appears." What does this mean in practice, these deep thoughts? One application for me is that I strive, I don't always make it, but I strive to look into the eyes of every individual student at least once every day of class to try to do that soul-to-soul connection. When you become, there's another gem from Levinas I love a great deal. It reminds me of some things Brother Brigham said on occasion. In front of the face, I always demand more of myself. A little less deep, but when I become deeply frustrated with students who quibble with me over points, grades, and seem to feature entitlementitis, a more obscure passage from Levinas tells us, the face is what forbids us to kill. It's from Ethics and Infinity, page 86. Good passage. Three quick observations heading down the home stretch. Number one, our students have been implicitly taught from a very young age that a screen is typically associated with being passive, or at best a mildly interactive consumer. If we want to train students to be deep, critical, intentional thinkers, the you may now shift into passive consumerist mode that PowerPoint can send if we're not careful may be the wrong message. Number two, regarding Manuel Levinas in the face of the other idea, if we are downloading information into students, and we often are, then PowerPoint is a very useful supplement where we get in addition to the audio, we get a visual representation. But if we are teaching students as human beings, then we must be highly attuned to whether they're checked in or checked out, whether they want to go deeper or move on, whether they are doubting or believing. See their faces, read their faces, read their eyes. Finally, a principle I found true. 1 hour spent with a student outside of class may be worth more than 10 hours spent inside the classroom. The application of this principle is expensive. Let us pay that price to know and love our students within the constraints that we face. My personal mission statement regarding teaching in the classroom is learn her name, recognize her face, and then listen to her story. My presentation in 9 words is bag 'em, use your gift, and see the face. I presented this for practice to my wife, who taught this morning down in exercise physiology, and she said, it's an engaging presentation, but both discussion and PowerPoint are still best. Couldn't convert my own wife, so don't feel bad if you're still leaving me in the wingnut camp. With that said, a final thought of my own in the adaptive linguistic style of Emmanuel Levinas. When the face of the other presents you not with the naked window to the soul, but to the closed eye, thou hast lectured too lengthily. Time to follow my own advice and stop.
Thank you.
I just realized that this year is the 30th year I've taught a course at College University, which is too long. It surprises me. I don't feel that old. So I went through the transition, of course, of pre-computers and no PowerPoints to using them all the time, and now I'm sort of to a place where I still use them, but I use them very differently than I used to. And what I found, and I'm teaching larger classes at the undergraduate level. I don't think I've had a class under 100 in quite a long time, and so I don't have the luxury quite to do some of the things Lauren does, and I can't remember names anymore. So one year I tried to remember all 100 names, and about halfway through I said, do you want me to work on the lectures, or do you want me to remember your names? You don't care about our names, and so I stopped trying. But so here's where I started. My father was a very good teacher and a very good speaker, and he would make us memorize as kids when we gave talks at church that outline, only the outline for the talk. And so we would have to know, and then we'd have to recite it for him. We'd have to give the talk to him, when we first were learning, and but no papers and then had to have the outline memorized and recite it to him. And then he would teach us how to teach by the Spirit. And he said, what you do when you know the outline is when you get in front of your audience and you feel like you should emphasize this part or that part, then you just disregard the other parts. So you're not, he taught a flexible sort of approach to your audience, not a rigid follow the talk, lead the talk kind of thing, which I was very, very grateful for. It was a great lesson. And so I started out teaching that way. I'd have an outline and I'd have some quotes, of course, and some sources and things that I want students specifically to know, but I would go with the particular class and be pretty flexible. I noticed after I started using PowerPoint, my flexibility got smaller and smaller. And when I started posting the PowerPoint slides, it was destroyed. So that the students would actually get upset when I diverged from the posted PowerPoint. So I started to feel like I was in a channel that was totally contrary to how I thought the best teaching practices were. So I stopped posting PowerPoints, and I got a lot of grief about that initially. Then I found some nice research that shows that when students have PowerPoints, what they do is they're more like transcription monkeys, in the sense they're trying to get every single word down and that you say, and then they have to fill in, everything. And so then when it's better if you help them learn to write things in their own words and summarize, and then they learn a lot better. And so I now use that research to my students the first days of class. And I said, this is why I don't post PowerPoints. There's two reasons. One, I want to be flexible, and I might only get to 2 or 3 or not any at all. I might feel like we need to go in a totally different direction in this class, and I don't want to be hemmed in by the PowerPoints. And number 2, you'll learn better if you'll write down in your own words what the main points are, rather than have the PowerPoint and then try to memorize the PowerPoint for the exam. And code better. And so they don't fight me anymore. They used to fight me a lot on, why don't we get the slides? Can't you give us the slides? And the other thing now, I teach sexuality, and one of the things I've learned is that some of these folks take some of this material and do things with it I would not do. And I would prefer that that's not me showing up in different congregations around the world in ways I don't want it to show up in. And so I find it's better to not have that material out there in that kind of a sense. So then what I do is I use the same format my father taught me. I have my PowerPoints are outlines of main points, and I feel no compunction or need to get through any of them. So often I will get through a half or less of the ones I might have, and as I flow through the class and feel the class out on a particular issue, I might spend 2 days on one thing I was only going to spend 1 day on. I might spend no time on it. Kind of depends upon what that class needs, what I feel like they need, what they're responding to, and especially when I'm talking about a very sensitive topic like sexuality, it can be very different year to year, just very, very different experiences, and we cover very different types of material. But I still like the outline. I still like sort of having that if I'm going to cover a particular topic. It keeps me rooted in the main principles. And of course I'll have a quote up there or something like that, or something longer that I want the class to read. So that's generally how I use PowerPoint. It feels much more flexible now, and it's so very different every single year. And I try to never give them the impression that we have to get through this material. We're running out of time, we have to get, there's something about that doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for me, and creates, again, a more relaxed atmosphere, and I think a better learning environment. So that's what I do.
Thanks, Dean, appreciate that. All right, Brock, don't you have a PowerPoint slide?
I have slides.
Good.
I don't know if I want to show up or not. after hearing all of that, so I think that it's true that that we represent sort of a spectrum of both competence and technological dependence, maybe, and I'm definitely on the low end of the former and maybe the higher end of the latter. Where's the? So I teach behavioral neurobiology and sensation and perception and cognition and cognitive neuroscience of long-term memory, and the, what do I call it? It's my fMRI class. It's the design and analysis of functional magnetic resonance imaging data. It's something nerdy like that. So you can sort of sense a theme that there are a lot of brains in my slides, and a lot of brains in my class, and a lot of discussion about brains. And so I like to use pictures of brains. There's a lot of research actually on whether if you're talking about a psychological concept, and if you put in a bar chart that just demonstrates the data versus a picture of blobs on brains, that people will believe the blobs on brains more even if the text is exactly the same. Like they rate it higher in scientific integrity and blah, 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 things like that. So I sort of take advantage of that and show lots of pretty pictures of brains, even though they may not necessarily be relevant. Hopefully they are relevant. One of the things that I teach about, oh my goodness, is, let's see, is there an HDMI?
Yes, there is.
I got it. There you go. All right, so one of the things I teach about is language and language acquisition a little bit, and we talk about B.F. Skinner, who's a behaviorist, right? So according to Skinner, all of your behavior is a result of operant conditioning. So babies, when they're learning to talk, they'll babble, right? They'll go ba, 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 da, da, da. And what do I do when the baby says da, da, da? Break out the iPhone, get out the balloons, do it again, right? The baby says ma, 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 silence, right? I don't want to encourage that behavior. Right? I want to reward one and not reward the other. And so Skinner says this is how babies learn how to speak. And so I give this illustration in class, and I say, you know, and the pushback against that is that that's ridiculous. So Chomsky says that people don't actually do that. Parents don't care about grammaticality, they care about truth value. And he gives some counterexamples, and one counterexample is a famous sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Which makes no sense, but he can say it, and he's never been rewarded for that before. And my example of that is, I've never been rewarded before for saying, I'd be happy to serve on that committee. And yet I say it all the time. And so this is a result of me saying that, because I was at some committee meeting, departmental meeting, a committee meeting, and I sat next to Mona Hopkins, and she said, you use PowerPoint, don't you? I said, yeah. She said, great, sign me up. So that's how I came to be here. Not because I have any particular relevance, I think, or any relevant expertise, but because I happen to be on the wrong place at the wrong time. Oops, not that one. So I've recently switched over from, I sort of feel like the people that the Apostle Paul talked about when he said that they're blown about by each new wind of doctrine, that I'm sort of blown about by each new wave of technology. And my most recent, let's see, let's pick a good one here. Or that one. The most recent sort of fad, I guess, is switching over to Google Slides. And I really, really like Google Slides for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't have to schlep my laptop to class. I can just show up, log into the podium, and pull up, like you just saw me do, pull up Google Drive, navigate to my presentation, and there it is. These are based on my earlier Keynote slides, so I use a Mac, and so I use Keynote instead of PowerPoint. But I converted everything over to Google Slides, and as I've been doing that conversion, I've been updating slides and things like that. So that's one, it's handy for me, because I can access this anywhere. If I happen to leave my laptop at work, I can get to it from home. I can get to these on my iPad. And two, I can post links to these slides on Learning Suite, and the students can follow along. So I'm sort of the opposite of not giving my students the slides. I give them everything. So they have it all. They know exactly where I am. They can see my presenter notes actually at the bottom of the slide. So if there's anything that I want to add to that, they can see it. And it's all pretty open and pretty available to them. I've only done that this semester, where I've shared the actual slides with the students. So it's sort of a work in progress. I'll let you know how it turns out, whether I go away from that again or not. One of the things that actually Mona signed me up for as well was for the same reason, actually. So she heard, when I first started at BYU, I used this program where I would podcast my lectures. So you start up the program, it's sort of like Camtasia, but a different version of that, where it'll record both the video of what's going on the screen and the audio of you talking. And then it'll make a video of that you can then post on, at the time it was Blackboard, but Blackboard kept running out of room and things like that. So I stopped using that just because of the sort of the back end issues. And so Mona knew that I had podcasts of all my lectures, and so she asked me to do the independent study version of this class. I ended up rewriting all of my lectures and re-recording them anyhow, because the on-campus lectures, I have a lot of dialogue and I ask a lot of questions, and so when it's not me talking but somebody in the class, there was like, my laptop didn't pick that up, and so it was silence. And then it was an answer, you could hear the answer to the question that wasn't on the audio, and so it didn't work out very well. But the upshot is that independent study actually made these great graphics for all of my lectures, and so I have like this theme of all of my lectures that have these great like intro graphics. So my lectures, I like to have a roadmap. So I like to use PowerPoint as sort of something to show brains, to show, if we're talking about neuroanatomy, then it's much easier if I can point to a picture and say, this is where the hypothalamus is, this is where it is in relation to the hippocampus. So I guess my first point is, how long have I been going? And my first point is, if you're going to use PowerPoint, use it to a purpose. Don't just use it to use it. And I fall into this trap all the time. Like I think, okay, I've got a lecture coming up, I better, write a PowerPoint for it, or write, come up with my slides. But the only reason to have slides is if you have a purpose for having slides. Don't just have slides just to have slides. And so my slides, first I've got this sort of roadmap so that I can signpost for students. And you've all seen great presentations where they'll keep coming back to this roadmap, or they'll have like, a visual indicator that across the top of the slides, for example, this is section 1, this is section 2, things like that. I don't do that. That's more work than I'm willing to put into it. But I have seen good presentations, so I'm not a great example there. So I use it to sort of give students some signposts, and then I'll throw a picture up here, and then I'll tell a story about Lashley. And maybe I'll talk about how he's my intellectual great-great-great-grandfather and something like that if that comes up. But also that Lashley did these great experiments with rats, and he comes to these conclusions, and this is sort of the state of the art in 1953, when along comes this guy. And then I'll show a picture of this guy, and nobody knows who he is from his picture, but every intro psych student has heard of patient HM, who's this amnesic patient. He had brain surgery, actually, to correct some epilepsy, and it worked in that they were able to control his epilepsy as a result of this. There was no theoretical evidence to support this surgery. It was complete cowboy neurosurgery, but they were able to treat his epilepsy. Unfortunately, the side effect was that he was completely amnestic for the rest of his life. So for 55 years, from his mid-20s until he passed away in 2008, never formed a new long-term memory. Every moment was a new moment, as if he was just waking up. And so, it stimulates this discussion. I'll tell stories about HM. And just use this as sort of as a reminder to me, and also something visual that the students can look at and say, oh, hey, there's a guy behind this story. And so that's kind of the purpose. And then there are brain pictures. And so I can point and I can say, at this point in the semester, the students have seen lots of these kinds of pictures, and so they can pick out what's wrong with this. That this big black void right here shouldn't be a void. There should be brain matter in there, right? And so there's sort of a purpose to all of this. And then if I skip ahead a couple of slides, I can say, look, this is HM on the left, this is another patient, EP on the right. Let me show you some videos of patient EP. This is somebody that I actually got to work with, and so I can have some interactive videos. And this video is actually pretty great. Oh, we've got plenty of time. You guys want to see a pretty great video? All right, hold on. Yeah, I think that's my end. All right, so this was my... So this is the downside, right, of using PowerPoint, is there was always technological issues. Okay, so the setup for the video is, this is from a PBS show hosted by Alan Alda, New Scientific American Frontiers, where they're interviewing this patient EP, and my old boss, my postdoc advisor, Larry Squire. And so the setup is, EP is sitting down at the table to do some neuropsychological testing with our lab manager, Jen.
EP can also copy complex drawings. And he not only has no difficulty repeating back a list of words, in this case, dog, raccoon, lion, and parrot.
Dog, raccoon, lion, and a parrot. Hey,
But he even has a little sly fun with Jen along the way.
what you gotta add is about 2 more.
Oh, really? Would that make it tougher?
And that would catch them. 7, you know. Leaf. Medicine.
EP really hits his stride when the testing of his cognitive skills involves Jen's laptop computer.
Gold. Having been in electronics over the years, I am amazed at all this. It's just wonderful. Believe me, little printed circuits, just, oh, you can't believe it. It used to be in a 6-foot rack, and down to this, it's just wonderful. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack.
But it's now that something odd about EP's behavior becomes apparent.
Printed circuits, diodes, triodes, and all that stuff in there. Oh, it's just amazing, believe me. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. It'd be in a couple 6-foot racks. It'd be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. And now look at it, down to this. Little printed circuits and...
So he's not aware that he's told us 3 or 4 times that he used to be in electronics, that a computer used to fill a room, and that now it's down to the size of a microchip. He's just not aware that he said those things several times.
No, he tells us the same stories again and again. We've heard these stories before, and we'll hear these stories again.
I read you some words about 15 minutes ago. 4 of them. 4 words. Do you remember me reading you 4 words?
No, I can't
No?
recall. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Don't need to
My
apologize.
mind is getting old.
That's okay. I read you 4 animals, and I want you to tell me yes if you think the animal was on the list I read you about 15 minutes ago, or no if it was not on the list.
Wonderful.
Okay? Cat.
Yes.
How sure are you?
I feel reasonably sure on that
Reasonably
cat.
sure? Uh-huh. Raccoon.
No. No, I feel no.
Giraffe.
Yes.
How sure are you that I read
I'm
you
real
about
sure on that.
Real sure?
They're beautiful animals.
Okay.
believe me.
Lion.
No.
Okay. Do you remember drawing something from me today?
No.
Drawing something about
No.
15 or 20 minutes ago?
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
They don't apologize.
So that wasn't clever editing. That was probably maybe 30 seconds to a minute between him saying, this would be in a 6-foot rack, and then Jen would probably say, oh, that's really interesting. On this next trial, what we're going to do, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of that trial, this would be in a 6-foot rack. I met EP maybe half a dozen or so times, and he was, every time I met him for the first time from his perspective. I'd introduce myself, and he'd maybe use my name, good to know ya. And then within a couple of minutes, it was obvious that he'd forgotten my name. And he would tell us a story about how when he was working before he retired, he worked on cabin pressurization, so that when you're in an airplane at 30,000 feet, you feel like you're at sea level. And so he had said that, research and development, that's where it's at. When I was working on cabin pressurization, we had these engineers from MIT, they were trying to come down to your level, you were trying to come up to theirs, that's where it's at. Well, that's really interesting. On this next trial, what we're going to do, so you do the trial, and then at the end of that trial, maybe a minute later, research and development, that's where it's at. When I was working on cabin pressure, and verbatim, almost, the exact same thing, over and over and over again. Not remembering that he had told you this. So this is probably my favorite lecture. That's why I chose these slides, because this is what I study. This is what really has drawn me into the study of learning and memory, is these stories of these amnesic patients. And isn't that really interesting, right? And so we'll have a discussion with the students about people like EP. Students will always have questions after this. And then, does anybody actually have any questions about EP? Anything that I can answer? to talk about EP.
How long was he like that? I mean, was it
So
onset?
EP had viral encephalitis instead of neurosurgery. So the herpes simplex virus attacked his central nervous system. He became amnesic in the late 90s, like 1992, I think. He was 72 at the time, and he passed away in 2008 as well. So it was probably maybe 15, 18 years that he was amnesic like this. And that whole time he never formed any new long-term declarative memories. In fact, after he became amnesic, he moved to San Diego, and we would ask him, where can you point to the Pacific Ocean? You know, San Diego is kind of a big landmark. It's sort of like the mountains are here. What direction is the ocean in? He was maybe a mile from the ocean. He got it right 25% of the time, where he was just picking a random direction. But if you ask him about his childhood home, do you want to see what he's like for his childhood home? I'll show you.
How about your house on Castro Valley Boulevard to the Hayward Theater? You know where the Hayward Theater is?
Yes, I would leave the house and turn to the right to A Street, down A Street to Castro Boulevard, and turn to the left, and it's in the middle of the block.
Okay, and if you didn't go down to A Street, if you instead you could take another street, what would you
The
do?
center, Redwood Road.
Okay.
Redwood Road would run right into it.
How about the public library, Hayward Public Library, from your house?
Be the same thing going down A Street, and then A, you have to go to the left to B, and it's on the corner. I don't recall.
That map in his head.
I know how to
He
get
can see all
there.
these streets. Mr. Red's bicycle around.
Last thing I want to talk to you about is the neighborhood that we're in now.
Here.
How about any of the streets around here? Can you tell me any of the street names in the neighborhood here?
No, I cannot.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you don't need to apologize.
Oh, I know where Castro Valley Boulevard, but that's where I was born and raised. But right here, I have to say no, I'm sorry. No, I just live right here. Yeah.
Enjoy the world.
I
rather than-
enjoy our area right here.
Okay.
We could be in. He was the best. He was like the nicest grandpa you'd ever want to meet. So this is my sort of best use, I think, of PowerPoint. And I sort of wanted to open it up, and I hope this is okay to maybe all three of us. I'll volunteer my co-presenters for discussion. What do you think? Is this comparable to how you use PowerPoint? Do you have any tips for me for using slides and visuals in class? What do you think? How do you use visuals?
Here's a more scientific question. So Dean has some advice, you have some advice. I've been juggling between these two. Like, how would we know which we should do?
I think what works for you, right? And what works for your particular situation. I mean, I'm responding to the incentives that I like to get good course ratings, and giving students access to slides results in good course ratings. I know, scientifically, I know that they're worse off. They're going to learn less. But I kind of don't care if they learn. I do care. I don't get paid if they learn. I do get paid if I get good course ratings. How about that? You're going to have to understand this. And I probably shouldn't admit this in front of my boss. But this is the way that that it's structured, and I have happier students in that case. I give them all this information. I tell them that having laptops in class is distracting, and it'll bring down your grade, a full letter grade. If you're trying to multitask, I tell them that it's better to, I'm a memory researcher, right? I know what results in better encoding, and I give them all of this information. But then I also think that, they're adults; they can do with it what they want, and I'm going to give them all the information in the slides as well. That's my perspective. I don't know. Do you have...
I think for me, Joe, it has to, in terms of if I put specifics, there's a couple of core things I feel almost unethical about if I didn't make sure they learned a couple of things, and typically each day. And so I make sure those are covered in some regard, but then I have this flexible window about how to, stretch that out or narrow it depending on the way the class is experiencing it. So that's how I think about it. Are there some really core things they just have to pick up? But then do I still have enough flexibility in a particular day to respond to where they're at and what they need to know? So for example, this particular class I'm teaching this semester has had a whole lot of what's okay and what's not okay kinds of questions about sexuality. More than any other class I've ever had. They want a lot of specifics, and I don't give a lot of specifics because it's not my business what they do in the bedroom. And so I spent a lot more time on the sexual decision-making process that couples have to go through, and helping them realize that it's great to have agency and have that the permission to make your own decisions together. Way more than I've spent on other classes because they kept focusing on that. They kept so it was really clear to me that was where their anxiety was at in comparison to another class. It was a different set of issues.
If you're teaching stats or
right, I teach
methodology
research
or
methods. You got to
writing
cover
and-
some structure, and it has to. And then when I teach research methods, I hand out the slides so I know they can get back to it and find it when they're trying to remember how to run an ANOVA and how to interpret it. But I don't go over that in class as much maybe as he does. I still go over what's behind the ANOVA and why do we want to use this and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How big are the classes you all teach?
Mine, this semester, I think I've got 40 in both of the classes that I'm teaching right now. That's
40
pretty
in
typical.
each?
40 in each, yeah.
I have 150 in mine.
150?
Yeah.
Average about 45.
What about the sexuality class? Same?
It's 150.
Yeah, so I'm not doing big intro sections, or even big stat sections. Yeah, I'm doing more, the things that I'm teaching are more upper division 300 level. There.
One of the challenges I'm envisioning is that if I open up for more flexibility, as in the two models that were first presented, because I tend to be more along your lines, a little bit more rigid, and I provide more information, but I have a much clearer vision of how I'm going to evaluate or test their knowledge. What I'm concerned about, and I'm looking for more, just some input on this end, is that if I am more flexible, how do you sort of keep up with that on a semester basis, knowing, reviewing exams or however you probe that learning, how do you keep track of that? If you're like, oh, you know what, we didn't have time to cover that concept or that idea in sufficient depth, maybe I should not test them at this level. Maybe this is, maybe it's more content specific depending on discipline. But how do you gauge that? How do you know what you're going to probe when it comes to examining them when you're more flexible?
Well, my exams are totally different every semester, obviously. And so that requires a little more work for me to track what we did and didn't cover and rewrite exams. That avoids the problems of exams getting out, though, and being able to cheat, so to speak, from year to year. But it does require a little bit more work. I do have my TAs write questions for every class period. They're sitting there writing, and they help me remember what we covered, and I'll ask them, did I cover that? I don't remember going over that. No, we didn't cover that. So then I won't ask questions. I should be a little more careful post-lecture to sort of map out a little more what we covered, but I depend on the TAs a lot more for that.
So you're just willing to put in extra effort or
Yeah.
work every semester to kind of,
Yeah.
in a sense, tweak and or revamp?
Yeah, the grading.
So do you predetermine what you think of as the essential content that must be delivered and what is more flexible that could be left out?
There's a core. There's always a core.
That must be.
Yeah, there's only a couple of slides usually. Versus
Each
I might
class
have,
period.
yeah, I might have 15 total slides available, and there's a couple of core, and then that the accordion thing goes like this, and then my tests change accordingly. And sometimes I'm flexible enough, like I'm going to go to a conference next week on sexuality. I'll probably come back and give an entirely brand new lecture or two based upon some of the material I pick up there. So we just throw out some other stuff and add that.
Similarly, I have some core content, usually 2 to 3 in-depth points per class, and then 1 or 2 that will be added. On that note of flexibility, it's been great to have a continuum, I think, to look at, and I don't think any of us would desire to be prescriptive, probably least of all me, as the crazy wingnut. But just a quick 1-minute narrative. My PhD mentor, my last semester, said, hey, why don't you go in and take a class? We'll prefabricate it. You can go observe at length master teachers around the university. I did that. It was a marvelous experience. And then I moved into the summer where I was teaching a couple classes. Worst teaching experience of my life. I think probably the worst teaching experience for my students, because I was trying to parrot and model what I had seen some master teachers do, and it wasn't congruent with who I was personally, philosophically, pragmatically, in terms of strengths and weaknesses and gifts. And it was very humbling to just have such a disastrous experience on the heels of seeing some master teachers. And that was a good pondering moment to think about, well, what is it that fits and why? And that's been a journey, and that's a bit of a moving target, I think, for me too. So I would never seek to be evangelical with my crazy approach, but I do think that in principle I feel deeply about finding something that's consistent with your gifts and also weaknesses.
Darren, there are a variety of test formats, right? So if you rely on multiple choice, I mean, that's difficult to revamp every semester. But if you're using essay questions, then those are pretty easy to be much more flexible with essay questions. And I try and do a little bit of both. So my midterm has a bunch of multiple choice that are core concepts that we have to get through, neuroanatomy and things like that. But also I have some more application questions that are essay questions. In fact, I actually give those questions out a week in advance of the exam. I give about 5 potential essay questions, and then I choose 2 from that list. So I tell students, go, write a Google Doc, do whatever you're going to do to prepare for those 5 questions, and I'll answer questions about those 5 until the exam starts. And then when you come to the testing center, just be prepared to answer any of those. And that gives me a little bit more flexibility to cover things that a little bit more wiggle room to sort of stretch.
I guess I just get excited about everything I'm teaching. It's like, this is all core. You need to know it all. There's nothing that should be dropped.
Right, exactly.
Nothing to stick on your floor. Just soak it all up. So.
The question is, how much will they remember 5 years from now?
These are BYU students. They're going to remember everything.
I mean, if you have 2 or 3 points and 75 minutes, those must be bigger points, though, too, right? I mean, because I'm sitting here, I'm struggling with this notion too about what does it mean to have 2 or 3 key points. I mean, yeah, I would have to aggregate my points. And if I'm going to aggregate my points, then what's the difference between aggregating points and having a whole bunch of points? So I guess I would like to see more about what you guys mean by 2 or 3 key points, because you gave us 2 or 3 key points and that was in 5 minutes. And I mean, are you done after 5 minutes then in each lecture? No wonder you get good ratings, right?
I wouldn't say 2 or 3 points for me. It's more than that for me. I'd say 2 or 3 slides
Okay.
are core that I feel like I need to cover these, and then often I will cover many more depending on the experience. To have the flexibility to move, it's a little bit scary sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the students don't want to go anywhere else, but then I typically have those other slides available if I need them. But and other times we get into one particular topic so thoroughly, and it's such a great experience of growth that it feels like it's worth that anxiety about not having it all mapped out. So.
Have you ever asked the students themselves how they prefer to get it from you, how they prefer to learn what it is that you share, and maybe at a mid-course evaluation time kind of probe that? How do you best learn? Should I keep this